Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wading into waters that, well, that quite literally everyone swimming in the pool of human existence has experienced.
Everyone. It's universal.
We are talking about pain. And, I want to start by throwing out the image that I think most of us have in our heads when we think about getting hurt.
Mm-hmm.
You touch a hot stove, a signal, like a little electrical wire, shoots up your arm, it rings a bell in your brain, and you yell, ouch.
Right.
It feels like a very simple, very mechanical input-output system.
Yeah.
It feels objective.
It does feel objective. It feels like a thermometer, right?
Yeah.
If the temperature is high, the mercury goes up. If the damage is bad, the pain is high. That's the classical view.
Exactly.
It's actually what René Descartes drew back in the 17th century.
Mhm.
He literally sketched a boy with his foot near a fire, and there's a rope or a filament connecting the foot to a little bell in the brain.
A bell in the brain. So that image has been around for centuries.
For centuries. But if you look at the stack of research we have on the table today, and we are talking about some dense, heavy-hitting papers from 2023, 2024, and even a brand new review from 2025, that bell on a rope theory isn't just a little bit simplified.
It's more than simplified.
It is fundamentally wrong.
Fundamentally wrong. That's a bold claim. Because when I stub my toe, it certainly feels like my toe is doing all the talking, not my brain.
I know, it really does.
But you're saying the sources we're looking at today, they just flip this whole script.
Completely. The headline, the absolute top-line takeaway from our primary source today, a massive 2025 paper by Van Strien.
Pain perception and modulation, right?
That's the one. The headline is that pain is not an input to the brain.
Not an input.
No, it is an output of the brain.
Well,
it is a decision. The brain decides to create pain.
Okay, let's pause right there because it sounds incredibly counterintuitive. If pain is a decision my brain makes, does that mean the damage to my body, the stub toe, isn't real?
No, absolutely not. The damage is very real.
Right.
But this is where Van Strien makes a critical distinction that we need to get straight before we go any further.
Okay.
He separates nociception from pain. These are two totally different things.
Nociception versus pain. Okay, break that down for me.
Nociception is the hardware process. It's the wiring. You have specific nerve endings all over your body called nociceptors.
Nociceptors, like noxious detectors.
Exactly. They detect noxious stimuli. So, intense mechanical pressure, extreme heat, dangerous chemicals. When you touch that hot stove, the nociceptors fire. They send an electrochemical signal up the spinal cord.
A wire.
That's the wire. And the message is just data. It's saying, data point, high thermal energy detected at coordinates XYZ on the left hand. That is nociception. But, and this is the absolute key, that signal is not pain.
The signal itself is not pain, so what is pain then, if it's not that signal?
Pain is the conscious, multidimensional experience that is constructed by the brain after it receives that nociceptive signal and evaluates it. Van Strien's exact words are a psychologically constructed experience.
Okay, but isn't that just semantics? I mean, for all practical purposes, if the signal goes up, the pain happens. Is there really a scenario where you have one without the other?
Oh, absolutely. And this is the proof. Think about the phenomenon of phantom limb pain.
Right.
Van Strien points to this as the ultimate proof that pain is an output. You have patients who have had an arm or a leg amputated. There is no limb. There are no nociceptors in that limb. There's no wire to send a signal from that hand.
Physically impossible.
Correct. And yet, these individuals experience excruciating, vivid, burning pain in a hand that physically does not exist.
So the input from the hand is 0, a complete flat line. But the output, the experience, is a 10 out of 10.
Exactly. The brain is constructing the experience of pain based on its own internal map, its history, its prediction of what should be there, completely independent of the actual wiring from the body. The brain has decided that pain is the appropriate reality for that missing limb.
That is honestly terrifying. It changes pain from a simple sensation like touch or temperature to almost like an opinion the brain holds about the state of the body.
That's a great way to put it, an opinion. And it can be a very stubborn one.
And our mission today then is to figure out how the brain forms that opinion. We're going to deconstruct what scientists call the pain matrix. We're going to look at the specific machinery, the nuts and bolts of how we hurt. And then what I'm really interested in is seeing if we can hack that system. Because if it's a construct, surely we can deconstruct it, or at least influence the construction process.
We absolutely can. When you understand the components, you begin to see the vulnerabilities in the system. And the research we have, specifically a 2023 book and paper by Richard Ambron called Toward the Unknown, Consciousness and Pain, It gives us the blueprint.
So let's get into that machinery. If pain isn't just one signal running up one wire, what is it? Because Ambron suggests it's not a single system at all.
Right. Ambron argues that for you to actually have the full experience, to say, I'm in pain,
Yeah.
you need 3 distinct systems, 3 networks working in concert. It's a triad.
A triad.
And if any one of them fails, the experience of pain as we know it completely falls apart.
Okay, walk me through this triad. What's the first system?
The first system is the somatosensory system. This is the data stream.
Mm.
It involves the pathways from the spinal cord to the thalamus and then up to a part of the cortex called the somatosensory cortex.
Somatosensory. Soma is body, so body sensing.
You got it. This system answers 2 very basic questions. Where does it hurt and how much does it hurt?
So this is the GPS and the speedometer. Left foot, big toe, heavy impact at 50 miles per hour.
Perfect analogy. It provides the location and the intensity. But, and this is crucial, Ambron, along with a 2022 paper by Rodriguez and colleagues, emphasizes that this system only gives you the awareness of the injury. It does not give you the hurt. It doesn't provide the suffering.
Wait, I'm struggling with that a little bit. If I know there's a heavy impact on my toe, surely that is the hurt. How can you separate those?
You would think so. It feels like they're the same thing. But clinically and neurologically, they are not. You can have full awareness of intense pressure or heat without the emotional quality of suffering that makes it feel awful.
Okay.
The suffering comes from the second system, the affective system.
Affective as in emotion.
Exactly. This involves a different set of brain structures, specifically the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, the insula, and the amygdala. This system is what tags the raw data with unpleasantness. It's the alarm bell that says, this is bad, I hate this, make it stop.
Okay, so System 1 is the objective news report. There is a fire at 123 Main Street. And System 2 is the panic and dread. My house is on fire, run for your life.
That is a great analogy. It's the difference between information and reaction. And then you have the third leg of the stool, the cognitive system.
And where is that?
This is primarily located in your prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain. This is where meaning, context, and attention are applied.
So this system asks the bigger question.
Right. It's asking, is this injury going to kill me? Is this a paper cut or a shark bite? Will I be able to work tomorrow? How long is this going to last? This system evaluates the overall threat level and directs your attention either toward the pain or away from it.
So it's really a combination of sensation plus emotion plus cognition. You need all 3 to get what we call pain.
Precisely. And the anatomy supports this clear separation. I want to highlight the thalamus here for a second because it's often ignored. We usually just think of it as a simple relay station, a passive gateway.
The brain's central post office.
Kind of. But the work from Rodriguez in 2022 and Ambron in 2023 shows that the thalamus is much more active. It's a sorter.
A sorter.
Yes. When that raw nociceptive signal comes up the spinal cord, it hits the thalamus. The thalamus then splits the signal. It sends one copy to the somatosensory cortex for the where and how much.
The news report.
Right. And simultaneously, it sends another copy to the emotional centers, the ACC and the insula for the ouch and the I hate this. And because the wiring is distinct, because these are separate pathways leaving the thalamus.
It means you could theoretically cut one wire while leaving the other one intact.
You are exactly right. And that leads us perfectly into the next segment, because I think this is where the real mystery lies for most people. We all understand the physics of getting hit. We get that part. But the suffering part, that's what destroys quality of life. That's what makes pain pain.
The affective component.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to understand that, we have to talk about the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC.
Okay, the ACC. You said it's one of the main players in this emotional suffering network.
It's arguably the most critical structure for the hurt of pain. It sits deep in the center of the brain, kind of wrapped around the bundle of fibers that connects the 2 hemispheres.
So it's very central.
Very central, very old evolutionarily.
Yeah.
We have a seminal paper here by Perry Fuchs from 2014, The Anterior Cingulate Cortex and Pain Processing, which really just dives deep into what this structure does. And Fuchs discusses some clinical cases that are frankly mind-bending.
You're talking about these cingulotomy procedures.
Yes, a cingulotomy. This is a surgical procedure, and it's a last resort, usually reserved for patients with intractable terminal cancer pain. I mean, pain that even high doses of morphine can no longer touch.
And what do they do in the surgery?
The surgeons go in, and they create a very specific targeted lesion. They essentially cut the connection in the anterior cingulate cortex.
So they are damaging the brain on purpose to try and stop the pain. And does it work?
Well, the result is fascinating and bizarre. The patient wakes up from the surgery, The doctor comes in and asks, how's the pain? Do you still feel it? And the patient says, yes,
Yeah.
I can feel it. It's right there in my back. It's a burning sensation, just like before.
Okay, so the surgery failed. It sounds like it failed.
That's what you'd think.
Yeah.
That's the logical conclusion. But then the doctor asks the crucial follow-up question. Does it bother you? And the patient says, no, not really. It's just there.
It doesn't bother me. I can't wrap my head around that. How can you have an intense burning sensation that doesn't bother you? The bothering seems like it's part of the sensation.
It feels that way to us. But this procedure proves it isn't. The bothering, the suffering, the unpleasantness is a separate neural calculation from the burning sensation. By lesioning the ACC, they remove the affective system while leaving the somatosensory system totally intact.
So the news report is still broadcasting loud and clear.
For fire at 123 Main Street.
But the panic, the run-for-your-life signal, has been silenced.
Precisely. They've decoupled sensation from suffering.
Did Fuchs mention any animal studies on this? I always wonder how we can verify this sort of thing outside of a person's subjective report.
He did. They use a standard test called a place escape avoidance paradigm with rats. It's pretty straightforward.
It's a setup.
You have a chamber with 2 rooms. One room has a comfortable floor. The other room has a floor that can deliver a mild, unpleasant stimulus, like a little shock or a hot plate.
And obviously a normal rat is going to hang out in the comfortable room.
Exactly. Within minutes, a normal rat learns to avoid the painful room. They don't want to be there.
Yeah.
But, and here's the kicker, if you create a lesion in the ACC of these rats,
What happens?
they stop avoiding the painful room. They'll just wander right onto the shock floor.
So they don't feel it anymore.
No. That's the critical part. If the shock happens, they still reflexively pull their paw away. They still show all the signs of mechanical sensitivity. The sensation is clearly there. But the motivation to escape, the "this is bad and I must leave" signal generated by the ACC is gone.
So they feel it, but they just don't care.
They don't care enough to move. The sensation has been stripped of its motivational power.
Wow. That really drives home the role of the ACC. It's not about feeling, it's about caring. It's what turns a neutral sensation into an urgent problem that needs solving.
Exactly. And to add another layer to this, we have a 2021 review by Xiao. The paper is called Role of the Anterior Cingulate Cortex in Translational Pain Research. Xiao frames the ACC's function as being a center for error detection or conflict monitoring.
Error detection, like a spell check for the body.
In a way, yes. Think about it. Your brain has a constant running prediction of how the body should feel. It's called homeostasis. Comfortable, safe, 98.6 degrees, no threats.
The default state.
The default state. When a strong nociceptive signal arrives from that stub toe, the ACC registers this as a conflict or an error in the system. It basically screams, warning, the actual state of the body does not match the predicted state.
Something is wrong, this deviates from the plan.
Precisely. And the greater that error signal, the greater the conflict, the more suffering you experience. The ACC is what makes a brain care about the error.
And you mentioned the ECC also connects to the amygdala, the fear center.
Yes, and that's a key point from Ambron's work. The ACC doesn't work in a vacuum. It's tightly connected with the amygdala, which is our hub for fear and emotional memory. So the ACC's error signal gets cross-referenced with your past experiences.
Yeah.
If you've had a bad experience with, say, dentists, the ACC and amygdala will light up much more intensely during routine cleaning.
So my memories and fears can literally turn up the volume of the pain signal in the ACC.
They absolutely can. The context provided by the amygdala helps the ACC decide just how big of an error this is.
Okay, so if the ACC is the alarm bell, the error detector, what is the insula? Because that's the other big player in this emotional system, and its name keeps popping up in all the literature we looked at.
The insula is fascinating. It's a chunk of cortex that's folded deep inside the brain, tucked away between the temporal and frontal lobes. The name itself literally means island.
An island in the brain.
An island in the brain. We have a 2024 review by Menon, Insular Cortex, a hub, that describes it beautifully. And you really shouldn't think of the insula as just one single thing. Menon describes it as having a gradient of processing.
A gradient, like it flows from back to front.
Exactly. You have the posterior insula, the back part of the island. This is the primary landing zone for all the raw data from your body.
All the data.
Everything. It gets the intensity of a touch, the location, the temperature, the visceral state of your gut, your heart rate, your breathing. It's the brain's main hub for interoception, the sensing of your internal state.
Okay, so the back of the island is the loading dock where all the trucks from the body drop off their goods.
That's the perfect way to think of it.
Right.
But then that information flows forward along the island to the anterior insula.
Mhm.
And this is where the magic happens. The anterior insula takes all that raw, objective data.
And it does what with it?
It integrates it with your emotions, your expectations, and your memories. It adds the subjective layer, and most importantly, it determines salience.
Salience. That's a word scientists love. What does it actually mean in this context? Break it down.
Salience is just a fancy word for importance or relevance. Think of the anterior insula as the brain's bouncer at a really chaotic nightclub. The posterior insula is the door. It lets everyone in. The thumping bass of the music, the heat of the room, the feeling of your shirt sticking to your back, the hunger in your stomach, the ache in your feet.
You're constantly bombarded with these inputs.
Constantly. But you ignore 99% of them. They're just background noise. The anterior insula stands behind the velvet rope and decides who or what actually gets to meet the VIP, your conscious awareness.
So it decides what matters right now.
Precisely. It asks the fundamental question for survival. Is this signal important? If someone bumps into you, the signal's there, but the anterior insula might say, not important, ignore. But if that bump feels sharp, like a needle,
Then it says, this is important.
it screams, this is salient. It opens the gate, and you feel a sharp jolt of pain. It hijacks your attention.
And when it decides something is salient, what happens then?
It activates what's called the salience network. It essentially acts as a switch. You have another 2024 paper here by McBenedict, The Role of the Insula in Chronic Pain, that explains this. When the anterior insula fires, it toggles the brain away from its default daydreaming mode and into a focused action mode.
It's an interrupt signal.
A powerful one. This is why when you smash your thumb with a hammer, you can't simultaneously solve a complex math problem. The insula has screamed, salience, and it has shut down all non-essential processing to deal with the immediate threat.
McBenedict also mentions a really strange condition connected to the insula called pain asymbolia. What is that?
This is very rare, but it happens when the connections between the insula and the limbic system, the emotional centers, are damaged. It's similar to the cingulotomy effect we talked about, but it can be even stranger.
How so?
Patients with pain asymbolia might perceive a painful stimulus, a pinprick or intense heat, but their emotional response is completely, utterly inappropriate.
Inappropriate how?
They might laugh.
Laugh at being stuck with a pin.
Yes, they feel the sharp sensation, they can report on it accurately, but because the integration with the suffering network is broken, the brain misinterprets the arousal. It doesn't know how to tag it emotionally, so it might just release laughter instead of a grimace or tears.
Wow.
It effectively proves that the appropriate response to pain, crying, fear, yelling is a calculation made by the insula. It's not an automatic, hardwired reflex.
That is distinctively creepy, but it shows just how constructed our reality is. Oh, okay, so we have the thalamus as the sorter, the ACC creating the suffering or the error signal, and the insula deciding if it's important enough to pay attention to. But who is in charge? Who regulates this whole messy system?
Now we get to the CEO.
That brings us to the executive controller, the prefrontal cortex.
The PFC. This is the wise, rational, forward-thinking part of the brain sitting right behind your forehead. We have a very detailed 2018 paper by Ong and colleagues, Role of the Prefrontal Cortex in Pain Processing, that maps this out. And this is where we get into the incredibly important concept of top-down control.
Top-down control. That implies the brain can tell the body what to feel, rather than just passively listening to what the body tells it.
That is probably the most important concept in modern pain science. We used to think pain was a one-way street, just signals going up from finger to brain. But now we know the brain sends massive signals down the spinal cord to modulate, to control the pain signals at their source.
How does it do that? What's the mechanism?
Ong's paper describes a specific neural loop where the medial prefrontal cortex, a part of the PFC, projects down to a tiny little structure in the midbrain called the periaqueductal gray, or PAG.
The PAG. Okay, what does that do?
The PAG acts like the body's own internal pharmacy. It is one of the most powerful pain-modulating regions in the entire nervous system. When the PAG is stimulated, it sends signals down to the spinal cord.
And what happens there?
It triggers the release of endogenous opioids.
Endogenous opioids. So the body's own self-made morphine.
Exactly. Chemicals like enkephalins and endorphins. When the PFC tells the PAG to activate, these chemicals are released right at the synapse, right at the point where the pain signal first enters the spinal cord from the nerve.
And they do what?
Block it. They literally close the gate. They bind to receptors and block the neurotransmission. The pain signal is stopped dead at the spine and never even reaches the brain.
So the CEO, the PFC, calls the pharmacy, the PEG, and says, Send a shipment of morphine down to the lower back immediately.
That's a perfect analogy.
Mm-hmm.
But the CEO has to decide to make that call. And that decision is based entirely on context, on meaning, on goals.
Give me an example.
Imagine you're a soldier in a battle. You get shot in the leg. The nociceptive signal is massive.
Yeah.
But your PFC evaluates the situation.
Yeah.
I am in a firefight. If I stop to cry about this leg, I will die. The most important goal right now is survival, which means I need to run. The PFC determines that feeling pain right now is maladaptive. It's a bad idea. So it activates the PEG, floods the system with opioids, and you might run 100 yards on a broken leg without feeling a thing until you're behind cover and safe.
We hear those stories all the time, people lifting cars off loved ones, athletes playing on broken ankles. This is the biological mechanism for that.
It is. The brain's goals can literally override the body's signals.
Well,
But, and here's a double-edged sword, it works the other way too. We have a 2024 paper by Coomer and Sheets targeting prefrontal cortex dysfunction and pain that points out that the PFC provides the emotional valence of pain.
valence, meaning whether it's good or bad, or more like the emotional weight.
The emotional weight, the meaning. If the PFC is in a state of anxiety, depression, or catastrophizing, thinking this pain will never end, or this means my life is over, or I am broken, it essentially loses its ability to call the pharmacy. It inhibits the PEG.
So if you're anxious or catastrophizing about the pain, you are literally cutting off your own supply of natural painkillers.
Worse, you might even facilitate the pain signal. The lack of top-down inhibition means the gate at the spinal cord just swings wide open. This is why anxiety, depression, and chronic pain are so often comorbid. They aren't just related. They are a failure of the exact same regulatory loop in the brain.
If the CEO is panicking, the pharmacy stays closed, and every single pain signal from the body flows into the brain unchecked.
Unchecked and often amplified by the time it gets to the ACC.
This is where it gets really, really interesting for me. Because if the brain constructs pain, and if the PFC has a dial that can control the volume, that implies we can hack the system. We aren't just helpless victims of our biology.
We absolutely are not. And the sources provide us with at least 4 distinct evidence-based ways this system can be hacked or modulated, and none of them involve taking a pill from a bottle.
Let's start with the big one, the one everyone knows but I think most people dismiss, the placebo effect. Most people think placebo just means it's all in your head, in a dismissive way, like you're just imagining the relief.
And that is such a tragedy, because the placebo effect is one of the most powerful demonstrations of the brain's ability to heal itself. It is a real, measurable, biological event, not a fake one. And we have a classic paper from 2004 by Wager and colleagues, Placebo-Induced Changes in fMRI. This study is famous for a very good reason.
Okay, walk us through what Wager's team actually did.
The setup was very clever. They took volunteers and put them in an fMRI scanner so they could watch their brain activity in real time. They would then apply a painful heat stimulus to the participants' arms. But before the heat, they applied a cream.
A pain-relieving cream.
Well, in one condition, they told the participants it was a powerful new analgesic cream. In another condition, they told them it was just a control cream with no active ingredients.
And in reality?
In reality, both creams were identical, just plain, inert hand lotion.
So the chemistry applied to the skin is identical in both conditions. The only variable is the person's belief about the cream.
Correct. The only variable is belief. But when they looked at the brain scans, the results were staggering. When people believed they were getting the analgesic cream, the fMRI showed a massive spike in activity in their prefrontal cortex before the heat was even applied.
That's the CEO anticipating relief. Help is on the way.
Exactly. The expectation of relief activated the PFC. And then, when the painful heat was actually applied, the activity in the thalamus, the insula, and the ACC, the entire pain matrix we've been talking about dropped significantly.
So the belief didn't just make them say it felt better to be polite, it actually stopped the signal from being processed.
It literally changed the neurophysiology. The software of belief changed the hardware of pain transmission. Wager's study strongly suggests that the PFC activation, driven by belief, triggered the P to release those endogenous opioids we talked about.
So the placebo effect is the top-down control system in action.
That's what the evidence says. The brain created real chemical pain relief solely because it expected to feel better.
That is incredible. It validates that mind over matter isn't just a feel-good slogan, it's a literal neural pathway. Okay, hacking method number 2, mindfulness. This connects back to that separation of sensation and suffering we talked about with the cingulotomy.
It really does.
Ugh.
There's a fantastic paper by Grant and Zidon from 2019 employing pain and mindfulness to understand consciousness. And they bring up an ancient Buddhist concept from a text called the Salatha Sutta. The concept is called the two arrows.
The two arrows, I love this parable.
It's so clear, isn't it? The idea is that when you are struck by an arrow, you feel physical pain. That's the first arrow. It's inevitable. It's just physics and biology.
Can't avoid it.
But then, almost instantly, we shoot ourselves with a second arrow. We start thinking, why me? This is unfair. This is awful. What if I die? It hurts so much I can't stand it. That mental resistance, that story you tell yourself about the pain, that is the second arrow.
And the Buddha said the second arrow is optional.
Second arrow is optional. And what's amazing is that Grant and Zidon actually found the neuroscience to back this up.
How did they test it?
They compared novice controls against very experienced mindfulness practitioners, people with thousands of hours of meditation under their belts. They put them all in the fMRI scanner and applied a painful heat stimulus.
And what did they find?
The meditators showed a phenomenon they called decoupling.
Decoupling of what from what?
This is the coolest part. The meditators actually showed higher activity in their somatosensory cortex than the normal people.
Higher, so they felt it more intensely.
They felt the first arrow more vividly, with more resolution. They were fully, completely aware of the location and the physical intensity of the heat. They weren't numbing themselves or dissociating.
But, there has to be a but.
But they showed significantly lower activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. They had almost no activity in the suffering centers of the brain.
They felt the pain, but they didn't mind it.
They felt the sensation, but they didn't suffer from it. They observed the sensation as just energy, just heat, just vibration, without adding the emotional tag of, this is terrible and I need it to stop. They successfully pulled out the second arrow.
It's like a functional, reversible cingulotomy achieved purely through mental training.
That is a perfect description. It's a superpower. It confirms that suffering really is an add-on feature that you can learn to disable.
Okay, that's incredible. Hacking method number 3. Attention and distraction. We've all done this, right? You distract a kid who scraped their knee. Hey, look at the birdie. Does that work the same way as mindfulness?
Not quite. It's a different mechanism, and we have a review by Bushnell and colleagues from 2013, Cognitive and Emotional Control of Pain, that makes a really nuanced and useful distinction here. It turns out distraction and a positive mood target different parts of the brain.
Okay, how so? Let's start with distraction.
Distraction, like doing a complex math problem or playing a high-speed video game or even just being deeply engrossed in a conversation, tends to reduce activity in the sensory areas, the somatosensory cortex, S1 and S2. It actually lowers the intensity rating of the pain.
Why? Is it because the brain only has so much bandwidth?
That's exactly the theory.
Yeah.
The thalamus and the cortex have a limited capacity for processing information. If you flood the channels with a difficult cognitive task, the pain signal simply gets crowded out. It's a bandwidth hack.
Okay, so distraction turns down the volume of the first arrow. What about mood?
Changing your mood, so improving your emotional state, listening to happy music, being with a loved one, feeling safe, that reduces the unpleasantness rating of the pain. It specifically targets the ACC,
The second arrow.
the second arrow. So distraction blocks the intensity, while a good mood blocks the suffering. Bushnell's work shows that different psychological tricks are like different keys that fit into different locks in the neural machinery of pain.
That's a really useful distinction. Which leads to the fourth area, which I found surprisingly profound: sleep. I've always wondered about this. Do we feel pain when we're asleep? If you poked me with a needle while I was sleeping, I'd wake up. But do I feel the pain before I wake up?
That is a great philosophical and neuroscientific question. And there's a fascinating study by Ponten and colleagues from 2019 called the pain alarm response that tried to answer it. They wanted to know if the brain reacts to pain differently when it's conscious versus when it's unconscious.
So they zapped people with heat while they slept.
Science requires sacrifice. Yes, they exposed participants to a noxious heat stimulus while they were awake, and then again while they were in deep non-REM sleep.
And what was the key finding?
Here it is. When you're awake and you get hit with a sudden, unexpected pain, there's a huge synchronized spike in brain activity. They call it the pain alarm. It's the what the heck was that signal. It's a novelty response, and it leads to habituation. You learn from it, so the next time it's less surprising.
Makes sense. The brain logs the threat.
But when the participants were asleep, and this is important, if the heat wasn't strong enough to actually wake them up, that pain alarm response was completely absent. Their brain still registered the heat at a low level, But the big conscious alarm didn't go off. They didn't develop the habituation or the surprise
Oh,
response.
what does that tell us?
It suggests that conscious awareness is required for the brain to fully learn the pain and construct the alarm. The pain alarm isn't just a simple reflex, it's a conscious construction. If you aren't there to observe it, if the eye is asleep, the alarm doesn't ring in the same way.
It reinforces that idea that pain is an output of the conscious mind. If the lights are off in the house, the doorbell doesn't really ring.
Or at least the homeowner doesn't hear it, which is what matters for the experience.
So we've talked about how the system works when it's healthy. You get hurt, the signal goes up, the PFC manages it, you heal, the pain stops. But we need to pivot to the dark side of this neuroplasticity. Because for millions of people, the pain doesn't stop. Let's talk about what happens in chronic pain.
This is where the story changes from a functional adaptive system to a broken maladaptive one. When pain persists for months or years long after the original tissue damage is healed, it stops being a symptom of an injury. It becomes a disease of the brain itself.
You say disease of the brain. Are you speaking metaphorically or do you mean that literally?
No, I mean it literally.
Yeah.
We're talking about structural atrophy of the brain. Both McBenedict's 2024 paper and Ong's 2018 paper discuss this in detail. Chronic pain is consistently associated with a reduction in gray matter volume in the prefrontal cortex and the insula.
Wait, the brain is actually shrinking.
In those specific areas that are constantly being overworked, yes. Imagine your PFC as a muscle that's holding a very heavy weight. That top-down inhibition we talked about is metabolically expensive. If it has to hold that weight 237 for years, eventually it fatigues. Metabolic stress sets in. The cells atrophy. The brain physically erodes under the stress of constant, unrelenting pain processing.
That is terrifying. But it explains so much. It explains the brain fog, the decision fatigue, the problems with emotional regulation that people with chronic pain often talk about.
It validates their experience completely. It's not just pain that they're dealing with. It's a literal degradation of the brain's executive hardware.
Wow.
And Van Strand's 2025 paper adds another mechanism to this at the level of the spinal cord. It's a process called LTP, or long-term potentiation.
I remember LTP from psychology class. That's how we form memories, right? Neurons that fire together, wire together.
That's the one. Usually we want LTP to happen in our hippocampus so we can remember French vocabulary. But in chronic pain, LTP happens in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord.
The entry point for the pain signal?
Right. If nociceptors in the body keep firing and firing for months on end, the synapses in the spinal cord physically change. They become hyper-efficient at transmitting pain signals. They install more receptors. They strengthen their connections. They essentially upgrade the dirt road of pain into a 10-lane superhighway.
And Van Strien explains that this leads to the separation between different signals breaking down.
Yes, the wires get crossed. The system loses its specificity. The separation between nociceptive signals, which mean damage, and normal, non-nociceptive signals like light touch, gets lost.
So a signal that should be harmless gets misinterpreted.
It gets misinterpreted and rerouted onto the pain superhighway. This leads to a condition called allodynia, where a light touch from a feather or the fabric of your shirt can trigger an excruciating pain response because the threshold for firing that pain network has dropped to the floor. The system is stuck in the on position, and the volume knob is broken and cranked to max.
Is it permanent? If the gray matter shrinks and this superhighway is paved, is that it? Are you just stuck that way?
That is the multi-million-dollar question in pain research. And the answer, thankfully, seems to be not necessarily. Ong's 2018 paper notes that successful treatment of pain can sometimes reverse these gray matter losses.
So the brain can actually grow back.
It's plastic. It changes in response to the constant pain, but it can also change back in response to relief. If you can stop the barrage of nociception, or, and this is key, if you can retrain the brain through things like cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness to reduce that effective emotional load, you can stop the atrophy. You can begin to rebuild the PFC.
So the erosion isn't a life sentence. It's a state of the system that can, at least theoretically, be rebooted.
Theoretically, yes. But it requires treating the brain, not just the body part that originally hurt. You have to treat the memory of the pain and the fear of the pain as much as the injury itself.
So to pull this all together, what does this all mean? We've looked at the thalamus as the sorter, the ACC and the insula as the suffering and salient centers, and the PFC as the executive controller. We've seen that pain is a construct of decision and output.
It means we have more control than we think. We are not just passive recipients of pain signals from our body. Our beliefs, our attention, our emotional state, these are not just fluffy psychological concepts. They are the dials on the neural control panel.
So we can't always stop the first arrow. The injury is biology.
That's right.
But we have immense agency over the second arrow, the suffering.
Immense agency. That's the message.
That is a very powerful takeaway. But before we go, we promised a provocative final thought. And I want to go back to Richard Ambron's 2023 work, because he throws out a hypothesis at the very end of his book that sounds, well, it sounds like pure science fiction.
It really, really does. Ambron introduces what he calls the local field potential hypothesis. Now, throughout this whole deep dive, we've been talking in standard biological terms, neurons firing, chemicals releasing, axons and dendrites. But Ambron suggests we might need to look at the physics.
The physics of pain.
Exactly. When a large group of neurons in the ACC, that suffering center fires synchronously, all at the same time, they don't just send chemical signals to each other, they also generate a localized electromagnetic field.
Like a little radio wave coming off the brain tissue.
In a sense, yes. A very weak, very localized one. And Ambron's radical suggestion is that this non-material representation, this localized electromagnetic field generated by the geometry of the neurons, might be what the subjective consciousness of pain actually is.
Wait, so the feeling of ouch isn't the cell itself firing, it's the energy field the cell creates when it fires.
That's the hypothesis. It's a leap, but it's based on physics.
That is wild. But if that's true, what are the implications?
If that's true, it raises a truly revolutionary possibility. If pain, or at least the suffering component of it, is just a specific frequency of electromagnetic field generated by the ACC, could we one day simply jam that frequency?
Like noise-canceling headphones, but for pain.
Exactly. No drugs, no opioids, no surgery, just a device that generates an opposing electromagnetic field that cancels out the specific suffering frequency.
So you could still have the injury, your somatosensory cortex could still know it's there, but you could simply turn off the field that makes it hurt.
It's purely theoretical at this point, but it follows the logic of the physics. If the field is the experience, then manipulating the field directly manipulates the experience.
Something to think about next time you stub your toe. Is it your toe hurting, or is it a tiny electromagnetic field in your cingulate cortex that just needs a little bit of static interference?
The science is starting to suggest it's the latter.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Stay curious.